My name is Margaret Holloway. I was a wife for 42 years, a mother for even longer. I've baked birthday cakes, held crying babies, and smiled through rooms where I no longer belonged. I gave everything I had to my family, quietly, willingly, until the silence they gave me in return became too loud to ignore. This story isn't about anger. It isn't about revenge for the sake of it. It's about what happens when a woman who's been forgotten remembers herself and decides to take back what was always hers. If you've ever felt disrespected, erased, or unappreciated, you're not alone. Please like this video to support stories like mine, subscribe for more, and tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? I'd love to know how far this story travels. It was one of those brisk autumn mornings where the sun struggled through the clouds, casting pale gold over the porch railing. I sat by the window with my knitting needles in hand, finishing the final row of a soft gray cardigan. The yarn had taken me weeks to find, the right shade, the right weight. I'd searched for it like a woman chasing a memory. Each stitch carried the rhythm of a name I hadn't spoken aloud in months. Harold, my late husband. He used to say gray made my eyes look like a November sky, deep and knowing. The original sweater, the one he'd surprised me with on our 30th anniversary, had long since unraveled in the wash, but I'd saved the imitation pearl buttons. I'd sewn them back on this one, carefully, reverently. It was my granddaughter Lily's 17th birthday brunch, and I wanted to look like I belonged. Not glamorous, not young, just presentable. A woman worthy of her family's eyes, even if they were always half looking past me these days. I took the bus instead of asking for a ride. I didn't want to trouble anyone. My son Brian and his wife Kayla had moved into a bigger house last year, one of those modern gray boxes with too many windows and no curtains. The lawn was perfectly trimmed, too clean, like it had never been touched by bare feet. The moment I stepped through the front door, I knew I'd overdressed. Kayla floated across the polished floors in a silk jumpsuit, gold earrings catching the light. The guests, all well-dressed couples and teenage girls with hair that fell in waves like magazine ads, stood around mimosa pitchers and canapes. Smiled and offered my modest gift, a little locket with Lily's baby picture inside. She smiled, tight-lipped, and thanked me politely before drifting off. Brian gave me a side hug, distracted by someone calling his name from the kitchen. I didn't mind. I found a seat near the window and folded my hands in my lap. Then it happened. Kayla passed behind me with two of her friends, carrying a tray of cupcakes. I caught her voice. Not loud, but not quiet either. "That cardigan," she said, with a little laugh, "looks like something from a thrift store ghost. So retro, it's practically tragic." Her friends laughed. I felt it before I heard it, the heat rising in my chest, the clench in my stomach. My ears rang faintly. I turned slightly, enough to see them glance my way before looking quickly elsewhere. I waited. Just one word. Just one defense. Brian was 5 feet away. He'd heard it. He looked down at his phone. That was when something inside me, not quite snapped, but shifted. It was as if I could feel my place in that house, quietly dissolving like sugar in tea. I didn't get up. I didn't speak. I sat perfectly still, hands on my lap, the pearls on my sweater catching the sunlight. I looked down at them, remembered Harold's hands fastening the original button so many years ago, gentle, patient, loving. The memory hurt. Not because it was gone, but because it had no place here anymore. I tried to eat. The tea was lukewarm, the cupcake too sweet. Conversations swirled around me like music I couldn't dance to. At some point, someone spilled something, and Kayla shrieked and laughed, dabbing at her marble countertop with a cloth embroidered with her initials. No one asked how I was getting home. No one sat beside me. I stayed through the meal because I didn't want to make a scene. That's the strange dignity of women my age. We're experts at swallowing silence. But inside, something was already retreating. A part of me, the hopeful part that thought maybe, just maybe, I still had a seat at the table, began to curl inward, quietly folding itself away like an old photograph. When the time came to leave, I slipped out without saying goodbye. The sidewalk was covered in amber leaves, and my shoes crunched over them like brittle bones. I walked 3 blocks before calling a cab with the last of my prepaid card balance. As I sat in the back seat, I looked down at the sweater again. The pearls glinted in the afternoon light, soft and elegant, so out of place in that sterile house. I thought of Harold. I thought of our first apartment, with its leaky pipes and peeling wallpaper, and how rich we'd felt just dancing to the radio. I'd worn a cardigan just like this one when we painted that living room pale yellow. I realized, with a dull ache, that no one in that house today had ever really known me. Not truly. And the cardigan? It wasn't the embarrassment. It was the mirror. It showed them what they had discarded. And it showed me too. The days after the brunch passed like shadows stretching across a cold floor. Slow, uninviting, and difficult to avoid. I kept waiting for the apology that never came. Or even a text. But silence, it seemed, had become the language of my son's household. A language I was no longer fluent in. I called Brian 3 times that week. The first went unanswered. The second, straight to voicemail. The third, he picked up with a hurried, "Hey Mom, I'm in the middle of something. Can I call you back?" He never did. A few days later, I saw the birthday photos on Facebook. Kayla had posted them with her usual hashtags. Elegant afternoon. Lily turns 17. There were group shots at the long table, golden balloons in the background, polished smiles. I stared at the pictures one by one. My chair was there, in the corner. But I wasn't. Cropped out or never in the frame. I wasn't sure which stung more. I closed the laptop and folded my hands, staring at the reflection of myself in the black screen. I looked tired, diminished, like a photograph left too long in the sun. For Christmas, I baked snickerdoodles. The recipe was Harold's favorite. He'd always said they tasted like warm hugs. I packed them carefully in a red tin, tied it with ribbon, and walked the 4 blocks to Brian's house. It had snowed the night before, and the icy wind nipped at my cheeks. But I felt proud, even hopeful, standing there on their stoop with the cookies in hand. Kayla opened the door with a surprised blink. She was in yoga pants and an oversized sweater, a phone tucked between her shoulder and ear. "Oh, hi, Margaret," she said, barely pausing the conversation. "This really isn't a good time. We've got a full house and Lily's friend is staying over." I held up the tin. She took it with one hand and flashed a small, polite smile. "Thanks. That was sweet of you." And then, almost as an afterthought, she added, "I'll let Brian know you stopped by." She closed the door before I could answer. I stood there for a moment, listening to the muffled laughter from inside. It was the kind of laughter that fills a room, that makes you feel like you're standing on the wrong side of the glass. That night, I sat at my old desk and pulled out the leather-bound journal I hadn't opened since Harold passed. The pages were yellowed at the edges, the ribbon bookmark frayed. I stared at the blank line for a long while before writing. I raised a man who cannot look his mother in the eye. I didn't cry. I'd done enough of that in the quiet spaces of my life. Instead, I turned the page and kept writing. Memories, fragments, feelings I hadn't admitted to anyone, not even myself. The act of writing was like stitching up a wound I hadn't known was bleeding. The house was too quiet. Even the radiator's hissing seemed to mock the silence. So I started taking longer walks. sometimes to the corner bakery, sometimes nowhere, in particular. But more and more often I found myself ending up at Harold's grave. His name was etched into gray stone, clean and crisp. Harold J. Holloway, devoted husband, kind soul. I would sit on the little bench nearby and talk to him, low and soft, as if he were simply sitting across from me with a cup of tea. I miss being needed, I told him once, brushing a leaf off his marker. I miss being seen. It was during one of those walks that I ran into Evelyn. She lived just 2 doors down, and had been widowed nearly a decade before me. We'd always exchanged pleasantries, but that day, she stopped me with a hand on my arm. "You've looked a little pale lately," she said gently. "Come over for tea sometime. I've got too many lemon scones and no one to nag me about cholesterol anymore." I laughed. A small, startled sound I hadn't heard from myself in weeks. That first visit turned into a ritual. Every Wednesday, I'd walk over with a little jar of jam or a tin of biscuits, and we'd sit in her warm kitchen, the smell of chamomile and old wood rising like comfort itself. We talked about our husbands, about music, about books we half remembered, and children who'd grown faster than we were ready for. Evelyn never pried. She didn't ask about Brian or Kayla, but I think she knew. There's a way older women speak with silence, a knowing nod, a hand squeeze that says you don't have to explain. One afternoon, after we shared a laugh about a ridiculous romance, "Novel," she said, "you still wear your wedding ring?" I looked down. I hadn't even realized it was still on my hand. The gold was thin now, dulled from time. "It's the one thing I still feel sure about," I said softly. "Everything else has turned to smoke." Evelyn reached over and patted my hand. "You're still here," she said. "And that means you still get to decide what happens next." That night, I sat with my journal again. I didn't write about Brian. I didn't write about Kayla or Lily or the cardigan. I wrote about myself, about the little girl who used to run barefoot through summer fields, about the woman who built a life out of love and compromise, about the widow who had forgotten how to dream. As I set the pen down, I looked around my living room. There were cracks in the wallpaper, yes, and a sag in the old armchair. But there was also my knitting basket, a photo of Harold and me on our honeymoon in the Smoky Mountains, and the scent of cinnamon lingering from the bread I'd baked that morning. I was still here, faded perhaps, but not gone. Not yet. Thanksgiving had always meant something in our family. Not because of the food or the decor, but because Harold believed in gratitude more than anyone I ever knew. Every year, we'd say one thing we were thankful for before the turkey was carved. Even when the kids got older and rolled their eyes, he made sure we held hands around the table. So that morning, I rose early, just like I had every Thanksgiving for 49 years. I peeled apples while the radio murmured softly in the background. Cinnamon and ginger, perfuming the little kitchen as if nothing had changed. I wore my floral blouse, the one Harold used to say made me look like spring even in November, and I buttoned up the cardigan. The pearls gleamed faintly in the morning light. The streets were quiet when I stepped outside, the kind of gray stillness that only happens before a holiday meal. I imagined the warmth waiting on the other side of Brian's front door. Laughter, cranberry sauce, Kayla's wine glasses catching the light. I knocked twice, then once more. The door opened with a sound that didn't match the day. A quick, reluctant creak. Kayla stood there, lips parted in faint surprise. She was dressed, but not in holiday clothes. More like something she'd throw on between errands. "Oh, Margaret," she said, blinking. "Did Brian not text you? We're doing something really low-key this year. Just a few friends. Really. Small." I held up the pie. I thought, well, it's Thanksgiving. Her smile tightened like a drawstring bag. "That's thoughtful of you, really. It smells amazing. But it's just not That kind of thing this year?" She didn't step aside. I had to peer past her shoulder to catch a glimpse of the dining room. The table was already set, candles lit, napkins folded like fans. I saw Lily tossing her hair back in laughter and a couple, stylish, young, lifting their wine glasses. And then, like something out of a cruel skit, a child I didn't recognize ran past us, holding my silver pie server. The one with the scalloped edge that Harold had engraved for me the year we hosted Thanksgiving for 18 people. I blinked. "I didn't realize there were kids," I said quietly. "I brought whipped cream too." Kayla sighed, shifting her. "Wait. Look, I don't want to be rude, but we've got a full house and there really isn't space. I can wrap you up a plate later if you'd like. Or Brian can drop it off tomorrow." Her tone was sweet, even soft, but I knew that voice. I had heard it at brunch, heard it in the way she closed doors behind me, in how she smiled without warmth, looked down at the pie, the crust still warm beneath the foil, and gently placed it on the counter behind her. "That won't be necessary," I said. My voice surprised even me, low, even, with no tremble. She nodded as if relieved. "Okay, well, happy Thanksgiving, Margaret." I turned and walked away. The cold hit me hard the moment I stepped off their porch. I didn't have gloves. I hadn't thought I'd need them. The wind sliced through the knit of my cardigan, and I pulled it tighter, fingers stiff. Behind me, the door clicked shut with a muted finality. I didn't cry. I didn't hurry. I walked slowly down the sidewalk, each step sinking into the crunch of frost-covered leaves. The pie smell still lingered faintly on my coat, and I could hear distant laughter echoing from the house I used to feel welcome in. There was something oddly clear in that moment, like glass shattering and letting in the truth. I had clung to hope longer than I should have. I had given benefit after benefit, excused rudeness as stress, absence as accident. I'd told myself they were busy, that families changed, that I needed to adjust. But they hadn't adjusted to me. They'd erased me, piece by piece, moment by moment, not cruelly, not violently, just with enough subtlety that by the time I noticed, I had already disappeared. I passed a mother and daughter on the sidewalk, the little girl holding a tray of stuffing, giggling as she tried not to spill it. The mother smiled at me as they passed, and I gave a small nod. It hurt, a sudden uninvited ache, but it was the kind of hurt that told you something real had just broken. By the time I reached my porch, my fingers were stiff, and my heart heavier than it had been in years. I sat inside for a long time without turning on the light, just watching the day fade into blue shadows across my front room. Somewhere on the mantel was a framed picture of Harold at our last Thanksgiving together. His eyes were half closed from laughter, his hand resting on mine. I picked it up, tracing the curve of his smile with my thumb. "I think I'm ready," I whispered. "I think it's time." And in the silence that followed, I didn't feel broken anymore. I felt ready. A few days after Thanksgiving, I decided to tidy the house. Not out of holiday spirit, but out of that hollow instinct that creeps in when you're trying not to feel too much. The kind that makes you rearrange drawers, sort through old boxes, polish tarnished silver. Cleaning had always helped me think, or not think, depending on what I needed. The piano bench hadn't been opened in years, not since Harold passed. The old upright piano sat against the far wall in the sitting room, a relic of when Lily was little, and Brian used to coax her to plunk out "Twinkle, Twinkle" with her chubby fingers. I'd dusted around it for years, but that morning, something pulled me toward it, as if the house itself needed to speak. I lifted the lid of the bench, expecting nothing more than sheet music and broken pencils. Instead, I found an envelope, yellowed at the edges. Sealed, but not tightly. My name was written on the front in Harold's unmistakable handwriting. Strong, slanted, a little too neat to be casual. I stared at it for a moment, breath caught somewhere between fear and memory. The house was quiet. No radio, no ticking clock, just the whisper of wind outside the window. I opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a notarized letter, legal-looking, official, dated almost 2 years before Harold's passing. The words were precise, carefully chosen. He had written, "This letter shall serve to clarify that the Holloway family home, located at 14 Cedar Glen Lane, is to remain in trust for my wife, Margaret Holloway, for the duration of her lifetime. Upon her passing, the property may be transferred to our son Brian only upon her consent and with her full understanding and approval." My eyes skimmed over the rest. Words like lifetime occupancy, sole authority, revocable, and finally, to be invalidated only in the event of fraud or coercion. I sat back, knees weak, the letter trembling in my lap. Because I remembered, months after Harold's death, maybe a year, Brian had come to me with papers. I'd just begun recovering from a minor stroke. My hands still shook. My vision blurred on bad days. He'd said it was just a quick transfer for tax sheltering, so we don't lose value during renovations. I hadn't read it closely. I had trusted him, trusted my son. I had signed. The memory slammed into me like a gust of cold water. The way Kayla had taken over the house so quickly. The designer kitchen, the stripped wallpaper, the missing chandelier I'd loved so dearly. The way she had begun calling it her home in conversations. Our place. My vision. I stood, heart thudding. I took the letter and walked across the yard to Evelyn's. I didn't call ahead. I couldn't sit with it alone. She opened the door and saw my face before I said a word. "Come in," she said simply, stepping aside. I handed her the letter with shaking hands. She read it slowly, mouth pressed in a tight line. When she finished, she looked up and said, "You need to speak to my son." I nodded. Her son, Thomas, was a real estate attorney. He came the next morning, bringing coffee and wearing a quiet expression that reminded me of Harold when he was about to deliver hard news gently. He read the letter twice, then asked, "May I see the deed transfer documents they had you sign?" I fetched the only copy I had, a packet of papers I had tucked into a file marked House 2019. Thomas laid them side by side with the letter, examining every line. Finally, he looked up. "Margaret," he said slowly, "this is serious. What they did, it isn't just unethical, it's fraudulent. The house was supposed to stay in your name, in a living trust. What they filed here shows that the deed was transferred outright, into an LLC." "Kayla's?" I asked, my throat dry. He nodded. "Holloway Design Group, LLC. That's her business. They used the renovations to shift the asset under her company's name, and they did it without your fully informed consent." I felt the room tilt slightly. I gripped the edge of the table. Thomas leaned forward. "You were recovering from a medical event when you signed this. That alone makes it suspect. But paired with this letter from your husband, this could hold up in court." I swallowed hard. "What would that mean?" "It means," he said carefully, "that you could reverse the deed. You could regain control of the property. And if you wanted to, you could sell it, or write a new will, or do nothing at all. But the choice would be yours, not theirs." I sat back in my chair, stunned, not from the legalities. Those were complex but manageable, according to Thomas. No. What stunned me was the ache that settled into my bones. The betrayal wasn't just Kayla's, it was Brian's, my boy, my only child. the one I had raised on gentle lessons and hand-sewn costumes and bedtime stories whispered in the dark. He had let this happen. Worse, he had helped it happen. I went home that afternoon with a copy of Harold's letter and a new resolve that I hadn't felt in years. I stood in my living room and looked around. This wasn't just a house. It was a vessel of laughter, of struggle, of the quiet life Harold and I had built. And now, it had been seized, rebranded, sterilized. No more. I sat down at my desk and pulled out the journal again. That day, I wrote, I thought they had taken my place in the world. But the truth is, I gave it to them. And now, I'm taking it back. I closed the journal and reached for the landline. It was time to reclaim my voice. It didn't begin with fury. It began with stillness. The kind of stillness that settles when a storm has passed and you're left with the wreckage. I wasn't interested in yelling, in burning bridges, in making a scene. No, I wanted something cleaner than that. I wanted control. My dignity. My place back in my own story. Thomas, Evelyn's son, was patient and deliberate. He walked me through each document, each next step, never once treating me like an old woman fumbling her way through legalese. He addressed me as Mrs. Holloway until I finally told him, "Call me Margaret, but only if you mean it." We filed a petition for deed reversal and property fraud. I signed the documents with the same hand that had once buttoned Lily's baby dresses and traced Harold's collar when he was too sick to speak. It felt right, strong, to use that same hand now to reclaim what was mine. I opened a new bank account under my full legal name, Margaret Rose Holloway. Not Mom, not Granny, not Ma, just me. We took steps to unfreeze my pension, the one Kayla had so kindly offered to help manage during my stroke recovery. It had been quietly linked to their household account for almost 2 years. I had been funding their dinner parties, their new countertops, their designer light fixtures, without even knowing. When I received confirmation that the account had been fully restored to my control, I sat on my porch, alone, and cried, not because I was angry, not anymore, but because I'd let myself be erased. And now, one brush stroke at a time, I was painting myself back into the picture. I began visiting the senior center on Maple Lane. At first, I hovered near the back of the room, listening to others paint and read and dance. But something about the hum of that space, the rustle of watercolor paper, the shuffle of worn shoes on the ballroom floor, stirred something in me. I signed up for a poetry circle. Then painting. Then, one rainy Thursday afternoon, a ballroom class. That first dance, a slow waltz with a gentleman named Charles who smelled faintly of eucalyptus, made me laugh in a way I hadn't in years. The mirror on the wall caught a glimpse of me mid-spin, and for a second, I saw the girl I'd once been, the one Harold had pulled close in our kitchen after Sunday dinner. It didn't last. But it didn't need to. It reminded me that joy still lived in my body. At a community estate planning seminar hosted by the center, a cheerful woman with a braided bun talked about legacy with purpose. I stayed after. I asked questions. And by the end of the month, I had rewritten my will. The inheritance they assumed would flow into Kayla's perfectly manicured hands, redirected. Half would go to women's shelters across the state, places I'd once donated to in memory of my mother, who never escaped the fists that bruised her body, but always dreamed her daughter would. Another portion would fund scholarships for women over 50 returning to college. I called it the Rose Fund, after the middle name I'd never liked until now. The final bequest was for Evelyn's granddaughter, Maureen, a young woman with too much compassion in her eyes and not enough stability beneath her feet. For kindness without condition, I wrote in the margin. I sold my vintage brooch collection, the one Kayla had once laughed at and called cheap rhinestones. Turns out, one of them was an original Weiss, another, a rare Trifari. Together, they funded every legal filing, every appointment, every retainer fee. I wore my simplest brooch the day I signed the final documents. A small bluebird perched on a gold branch. Harold gave it to me on our 10th anniversary, said it reminded him of how I sang while baking, and then came the final stroke. I wrote a letter. Notarized, firm, quiet in tone, but sharp in truth. I addressed it to Brian and Kayla. This is not vengeance. This is restoration. I gave you love, and you gave me silence. I gave you trust, and you gave me terms. You taught me how invisible a woman can become when she's no longer useful to the people she raised. But you forgot something. I built the ground you now walk on, and I have every right to take it back. Then, I scheduled a meeting at the house. My house. The one where I'd baked birthday cakes and rocked Lily to sleep and kissed Harold goodnight for 34 years. The one they had painted over and gutted and renamed. Thomas would be there. The reversal deed. The will. The account statements. Every quiet weapon, lined in paper and ink, ready for unveiling. As I folded the letter and placed it into its envelope, I paused. I walked to my bedroom closet, opened the cedar chest, and removed the cardigan, the one with the pearls. I'd almost left it buried, but no, it would come with me. Not as a symbol of shame, but as armor. The first stitch I'd ever taken back. It was raining the day I went back. A soft, unrelenting drizzle, like the sky itself had chosen not to cry but to whisper its disapproval. I wore navy blue, Harold's favorite color on me. My hair was set, simple pearls at my ears. No makeup, just pressed lips and steady eyes. Evelyn met me outside with her umbrella and a quiet nod, and Thomas followed behind us in his long coat, leather satchel tucked beneath one arm. Brian's house, no, my house, looked the same as ever. Polished to perfection, sterile, loveless. Rang the bell. Kayla opened the door. For a split second, she didn't recognize me, or maybe she simply hadn't expected to. Her smile flickered, and then dropped entirely when she saw who flanked me. "Margaret," she said cautiously, eyes flitting to Thomas. "What's going on?" "We'll come in, thank you," I said calmly, stepping over the threshold. She hesitated, but didn't stop us. The living room was warm and full of light. The scent of some expensive citrus candle lingered in the air. I remembered when this room smelled like cinnamon rolls and Harold's aftershave. Brian emerged from the hallway, his brow creased with confusion. "Mom?" I took my time, removed my gloves, placed my umbrella in the brass stand by the door. Then I walked across the hardwood floor to the kitchen island, the same marble counter I once used to roll out cookie dough with Lily perched on a stool beside me. I reached into my leather folder and placed the first document down. Then the second, then the third. A quiet, steady stack. Not chaotic, not loud. Just true. "This," I said, "is the original deed and trust, signed by Harold and notarized before his passing. It confirms that this house was to remain mine until I died or chose otherwise." I looked at Kayla. Her face had begun to twist. "This," I continued, placing the second paper, "is the fraudulent transfer document, the one I signed under. Medical distress, and without full comprehension. Your company, Holloway Design Group, assumed control of this house illegally." Kayla let out a half laugh, the kind people use when they're trying not to panic. "You're confused, Margaret. That was all handled with legal advisors. You agreed." Thomas stepped forward, his voice smooth but firm. "It's called coercion. And when paired with pre-existing documents and the state of your mother-in-law's health at the time, it's legally indefensible." Brian sat down. He didn't say a word. I continued. "And this," I said, laying down the last set of papers, is the updated will. The house is no longer yours to inherit. Neither is a single penny you expected to receive. You can't do this, Kayla snapped, her voice rising. This is vindictive. You're just angry and old and— She's finally awake, Thomas cut in smoothly. You used her, and now you've lost what you tried to steal. Brian rubbed his hands over his face. Kayla, is this true? Oh, don't play dumb, Brian, she spat. You said it was fine. You said she didn't care. I trusted you, I said sharply, the first real edge in my voice. I trusted both of you. The room fell into a tense, heavy silence. I reached into my bag one last time and pulled out a small, carefully folded box. Cardboard. Nothing fancy. I placed it on the counter between us. Kayla stared at it like it might burn her fingers. I gave a faint, tired smile. Inside is the cardigan. The one you mocked. The one you laughed at behind my back. Her mouth opened to object, but I raised my hand. I'm giving it to you, Kayla, I said softly. Because it suits you better than it suits me now. A facade of grace stitched together with borrowed pearls. Her eyes shimmered with something. Maybe fury, maybe shame, maybe the first glimpse of consequence. I turned to Brian. You could have told me the truth. You could have protected what your father and I built. Instead, you watched it get torn apart piece by piece and said nothing. He opened his mouth but couldn't find words. I'm not here to punish you, I said, voice lowering. I'm here to finish what I started. I've already spoken to the bank. The deed reversal is final. The property is mine again. You will vacate within 30 days. Kayla exploded then, shouting something about rights, about suing me, about entitlement. I let her voice roll over me like wind against stone. I had nothing left to fear from her. Thomas began listing the legal requirements in cool, practiced tones. I stepped out of the room, Evelyn beside me, and as I passed through the hallway, I ran my hand along the wall. There, beneath the layers of new paint and modern art, I remembered, where Lily had once drawn a crooked sun with a yellow crayon, where Harold had kissed my forehead on our last Christmas morning. This wasn't just a house. It was mine. And it had remembered me. It had been 2 years since I last stepped inside that house. 2 years since I laid the papers down on the marble counter, returned the cardigan, and reclaimed what was mine. Now, I lived in a small house by the lake, not grand, not flashy, just enough space for me, my books, my paints, and a view that changed with every season. The morning light came soft across the water, and in the evenings, the sky turned lavender before settling into sleep. Peace lived here, not because everything had been resolved, but because I had. At the senior center, I taught a memoir writing class every Thursday morning. We called it Ink After 70. We wrote about first loves and lost homes, about daughters who forgot to call and husbands who died holding our hands. We didn't write for publication. We wrote for each other. To witness, to heal. One day, I received a letter in my mailbox. It was handwritten, folded in blue stationery with delicate silver trim. Inside were 6 pages, all from different women, thanking me for the Holloway Fund. One had gone back to college at 63 to study theology. Another had opened a shelter for women over 50 facing eviction. A third had simply enrolled in a watercolor class and wrote, I hadn't held a brush since my wedding day. Thank you for helping me find her again, the girl I used to be. I placed the letters in a box on my bookshelf, next to Harold's photo. Sometimes I spoke to him still, in quiet moments, in the hush between tea and twilight. That afternoon, I was sitting in my garden, pruning the lavender bush, when Evelyn appeared with a small package. No return address, she said, handing it to me, but I have my suspicions. I opened it slowly. Inside was a folded shawl, sky blue, soft as breath, hand-knit. Along the hem, the old pearl buttons had been carefully sewn, one by one, gleaming gently in the sun. There was a note tucked between the folds. You turned pain into beauty. I hope this keeps you warm. No signature. But I knew, and I forgave her. Not with words, not with ceremony. Just with the acceptance that some things mend themselves slowly, and not everything broken stays that way. Later that week, an envelope arrived, from Lily. A formal invitation to her daughter's school recital. I'd love if you could come, it said in neat script. Mom doesn't need to know. I just want my daughter to know you. I cried then, not because I was sad, but because the thread between generations hadn't fully frayed. It was thinner, more delicate, but it was still there. That night, I sat in my writing chair with my journal. I opened to a fresh page. The last one. I wrote, "My life is not made of what they took. It is made of what I chose to keep, and what I chose to build after." The wind moved through the curtains. The sun was just setting, casting everything in gold. I closed the journal and looked out across the lake. I never needed to be feared, I whispered, to be remembered. I just needed to remember myself, and I had.